Many observers believe that the Russia Ukraine war represents not only a clash between two nations with intertwined histories, but also a pivotal moment that forces the entire world to reconsider assumptions about security, diplomacy, and the meaning of sovereignty in modern times. And these observers often note that, from the earliest sparks of tension to the large scale conflict familiar today, the war has evolved into a complex symbol of how fragile international order can become when political ambitions collide with the aspirations of an independent nation seeking to chart its own future. Analysts frequently argue that Russia's decision to escalate the conflict reflects a mixture of strategic calculations, long standing political narratives, and a desire to maintain regional influence, while Ukraine's unwavering resistance demonstrates both national pride and a broader commitment to democratic values, which many citizens see as essential to their identity. Yet, beyond these broad explanations, commentators emphasize that the situation cannot be reduced to simple motivations, as each side views the conflict through its own historical lens, shaped by decades of cultural ties, political disagreements, and competing interpretations of past events. As the war has continued, political experts often highlight the ripple effects spreading far beyond the front lines. European countries have restructured energy policies, global markets have experienced disruptions, and many nations have reconsidered how prepared they are to respond to sudden geopolitical crises, turning this regional war into a global cautionary tale. In this light, the conflict becomes more than just a military struggle. It becomes a catalyst for reevaluating global cooperation, revealing both the strengths and limitations of institutions designed to prevent large-scale conflict. At the same time, many neutral observers note that the human impact cannot be overlooked, as millions of Ukrainian civilians have faced displacement, uncertainty, and the need to rebuild their lives from the ground up, while Russian families, too, have watched their country face economic pressure, shrinking diplomatic ties, and internal debates about the long-term costs of a prolonged war, creating difficult conversations within both societies about what sacrifices are acceptable in the pursuit of political goals. Furthermore, geopolitical thinkers often describe the war as a turning point for NATO and other international alliances, arguing that the unity seen among many Western nations demonstrates a renewed belief in collective security, even as critics warn that heightened military involvement risks further escalation. This tension between deterrence and diplomacy forms one of the central debates surrounding the conflict, and many analysts believe it will shape foreign policy decisions for decades to come. In addition, discussions about international law have grown more urgent, with legal scholars stressing that borders must remain respected and that aggression, regardless of justification, threatens global stability. Others argue that long-term peace requires acknowledging the concerns of all parties involved, even when doing so complicates the narrative of clear right and wrong. The complexity extends to the information environment as well, where narratives from both sides compete for global attention, highlighting how modern conflicts are fought not only with traditional weapons, but also through media, public opinion, and diplomacy. Observers frequently point out that this information battlefield influences how nations respond, how citizens interpret events, and how future generations will remember this era. Because of this, many experts believe that resolving the war will require not only military or political agreements, but also a careful effort to rebuild trust and create a version of events that allows both sides to move forward without feeling that their core identity or dignity has been undermined. Another dimension often discussed by commentators is the economic impact of the conflict, which has reverberated across continents through shifts in energy prices, agricultural exports, supply chains, and defense spending. Ukraine, historically a major agricultural exporter, has faced immense difficulty maintaining production and transportation networks, which in turn affects global food supplies, especially in countries that rely heavily on imported grain. Russia, meanwhile, has had to adapt to sanctions and economic restrictions that have reshaped its trade relationships and encouraged the development of alternative markets, creating a new kind of global economic landscape that might endure long after the war ends. Economists note that this reshuffling of global markets illustrates how interconnected the world has become, as a conflict in one region can influence the price of goods, access to resources, and financial stability across the globe. These economic consequences fuel debates among policymakers who must balance domestic concerns, humanitarian responsibilities, and long term strategic interests, a process that becomes more complicated the longer the war continues. Cultural analysts also weigh in on the conflict, pointing out that the war has intensified national identities on both sides, with Ukrainians expressing a stronger sense of unity and independence than ever before, and many Russians feeling a renewed attachment to historical narratives about their nation's role in the region. These cultural elements shape how citizens perceive the conflict and influence their expectations for the future, often making compromise more difficult because identity based motivations are not easily changed by political negotiations. Despite this, some experts believe that the eventual path to peace will require acknowledging these cultural perspectives rather than dismissing them, since lasting agreements must resonate with the people who will live with the consequences. International diplomats frequently argue that although military strategies dominate headlines, the ultimate resolution will likely come from negotiations that require patience, creativity, and a willingness to address underlying tensions that existed long before the current conflict escalated. This includes questions about security guarantees, regional cooperation, political autonomy, and the nature of international partnerships in Eastern Europe. However, diplomats also acknowledge that achieving such a resolution is extremely challenging, given the current climate of mistrust, competing interests, and high political stakes for both countries. Even so, many remain hopeful that diplomacy, perhaps through phased agreements, international mediation, or long term confidence building measures, will eventually create conditions where open dialogue can lead to meaningful progress. Ultimately, many analysts conclude that the Russia Ukraine war has become a powerful example of how modern conflicts are shaped not just by military strength, but by values, alliances, historical narratives, economic pressures, and the hopes of everyday people who want peace, stability, and the freedom to shape their own futures. According to these observers, the conflict stands as a reminder that the world remains in a delicate balance. Global cooperation is essential, yet fragile, and the choices nations make during crises will influence international norms for generations. In this sense, the war is not only a tragedy but also a test, one that challenges nations to uphold principles of sovereignty, justice, and diplomacy, even when the path forward is uncertain. And while the outcome remains impossible to predict with certainty, many believe that the lessons learned from this conflict will shape global decision-making for decades, reminding leaders everywhere that the pursuit of power must always be weighed against the human need for peace, stability, and the chance to build a future free from the shadow of war.